Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for being here today and for your testimony and comments. You know, I've been a member of this committee, and I think the Chairman has also, for 8 years now. And for 8 years, we've had economists and other experts come and tell us that we have a structural deficit problem that is unsustainable, and we need to do something about it. So far, we've failed to heed the warning. We are now at a situation where I think if we don't heed the warning, there's going to be consequences to play that nobody is willing to accept. And the sad thing about it is that both parties, Republicans and Democrats, sit and demonize one another no matter what we try to do to address this problem. We call the Democrats just tax and spend liberals that don't care about the economy, and they try to show us pictures of Paul Ryan pushing Grandma off the cliff. Unfortunately, that doesn't solve the problem. When everyone in this room, everyone listening to us, and everyone on this committee knows what has to be done. We've had several commissions that have looked at what needs to be done. They all say, almost universally, that you've got to get to $4 to $6 trillion in savings if you're going to have an impact on the long-term deficit of this country, whether it's Simpson Bowles, Domenici-Revlin, the Gang of Six, or whatever. We all know that we've got to restrain discretionary spending. We all know that we've got to get entitlements under control. And we all know that we need a pro-growth tax policy in this country instead of a 19th century tax code, one that fits the 21st century. We all know that. We might have some differences of exactly how to do some of these things, but we all know that the problem exists, and we all know we've got to come together. What we need is an armistice between Republicans and Democrats to solve this problem, because if we don't, all of these other things we talk about aren't really going to matter, are they?
That's correct. It is, I think, striking that when the U.S. Debt was downgraded by S&P last summer, it was more about what they cited was the political concerns about the ability of the Congress to work effectively to make progress. So it's easy for me to say. Obviously, I recognize that politics is a tough game, and that there are a lot of disagreements in Congress. But obviously, the more that can be done to show cooperation and collaboration on this very important issue. I think we all agree on the issue, as you say, so I hope very much.
I was surprised that this last 1st of January, I was in New Zealand and Australia and the Philippines, and talking with officials there and businesses there, I was surprised that they are really watching Congress. They're worried about Congress's inability to get together to solve this problem, because they know that the problem is going to extend to them if we don't solve our problem here. And I was surprised that they follow us as closely as they do. But let me ask you, do you believe that the general assumption that we have to get to $4 to $6 trillion in savings is the right number, or a number that will stabilize our deficit and get us headed in the right direction? And could you paint a picture, because it's sometimes hard for us to explain to the public what could potentially happen if we don't do anything. Could you paint a picture for us of what you think will happen to this economy if we don't take the steps necessary to stabilize our debt, and if we put it off for another year or another year after that, as we've been kicking that can down the road forever?
The $4 to $6 trillion, Congressman, was a number that was talked about for the next decade. Right. And the idea was that achieving that would stabilize the debt-GDP ratio and maybe get some progress there. And I was supportive of going big, so to speak, when we were discussing all these issues. We, the country, were discussing these issues last summer. So yes, you know, I think a very substantial additional attack on the deficits is needed. But the other point I would make is that the $4 trillion, the $6 trillion number is about the next decade. Right. The biggest problems we have are beyond the next decade. They stretch out into the next 20 or 30 years as entitlement costs in particular begin to rise further, and as our demographics begin to move, I guess some would say adversely. So one thing I would urge you as you think about these issues is not just to focus only on the 10-year official budget window, but to think about the longer term, even beyond 10 years, because what we've seen, an example would be the Social Security reform that was done in the early 80s, which is still phasing in. It's not even all phased in yet, 30 years later. The more time you give people, the slower the process, the more warning, the more likely it's going to be successful both politically and economically. So you need to look beyond 10 years. In terms of the implications for the economy, I think the good scenario is that, you know, we have, when the economy recovers, that we have higher interest rates, we have higher borrowing abroad, we have a slower growing economy, slower productivity gains, et cetera. As I discussed in my testimony, the bad case scenario, which ultimately will happen if we don't change this trajectory, is that, analogous to what we've seen in some countries in Europe, that investors will begin to lose confidence that we can manage our long-term fiscal situation, and we'll see sharp movements in interest rates or loss of confidence in U.S. debt, in which case changes would have to be made, but in a much more chaotic, rapid, and a disruptive way than by doing it in a long-term, thoughtful way.
Thank you. Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. Thank you again, sir, for joining us. I cringed a little with my good friend from New Jersey's portrayal. It seems to me that you are independent of Congress. You're not CBO. You are managing the monetary system, and you are purposefully an independent agency trying to insulate the notion that somehow you're at the beck and call of a particular administration or Congress. My understanding is that's the structure that is in place to try and give you that independence. Am I missing something here?
Well, the Fed was created by Congress, but Congress did set us up in a way, for example, 14-year terms for governors and so on, to try to create independence in making monetary policy decisions. We have a number of roles, including supervisory roles and so on, which bring us into contact with issues related to housing and mortgages and so on. But again, I just want to be clear to this committee that our intention was to try to provide useful background, and we, in all cases, looked at both sides of the issue, and we recognize, we have no doubt whatsoever that it's Congress that has to make those decisions.
And I appreciate that. And I am of the, having been here through some of the stormy weather, I think there are lessons to be learned by all of us. I think you, some of your governors, looking at the events. I hope Congress is looking at what we did or didn't do. Hopefully people in the private sector. The notion that somehow we might ask the Fed to come up with a report on the Recovery Act. I mean, there is an independent agency. It's called the CBO, which we set up to give us that, who produced such a report that said that it raised real inflation-adjusted GDP between 0.3% and 1.9%, that it lowered the unemployment rate between 0.2% and 1.3%. It increased the number of employed between 400,000 and 2.4 million, and increased the number of full-time equivalent jobs by between 500,000 and 3.3. That's an independent agency that Congress set up. You may not like the answer, but asking somebody else, an independent agency, to do it, I think is not going to get us any further down the line. I am personally struck by what my good friend from Idaho said, because as usual he's making sense, get to it, deal with the notion, and I have opined in this committee and elsewhere that we know what to do. It's not that hard, that we could do things to rein in military spending without putting us at risk. We could reform agricultural spending. We could, in fact, move to have a healthcare system that rewards value instead of volume, that meets Mr. Bernanke's test, which isn't just in 10 years. The real test is 20 and 30 years that potentially sinks us. And I'm hopeful that we're able to focus on the big picture, that this budget committee, in the course of our deliberation, can look at things that actually enjoy bipartisan support that could make a difference over the next quarter century, and not have the picture that is being portrayed today and yesterday by independent experts become a fulfilling prophecy. I just feel from the bottom of my heart that this is something we ought to be focusing on, and in particular, the notion that we are looking at the longer term. We live with a 10-year budget window, but the real challenges are beyond that. And that's where the savings have to occur. That's where it actually gets easier, not harder. And for us to bludgeon the Fed, and I think you've done an extraordinary job trying to balance being more transparent in what you're doing, but not spooking people, not adding fuel to one fire or the other. I appreciate your continued patience coming here, although I know it's probably a statutory duty, but you do it with
No, he's
good,
actually doing it at his own volition.
with good humor, and I don't know that we have subpoena power, but I'm hopeful that we can focus on the lessons that we learned or should have learned and get to the work that Mr. Simpson talked about in terms of getting to it.
Sounds like an endorsement of our budget.
I'll yield back.
Thanks.
I'm with you.
Okay, thank you. You are.
I hope you start on military.
Okay.
And I hope we build.
Your gentleman's time has expired.
I hope we build on what used to be bipartisan approaches to controlling medical expenses.
Agreed. Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Bernanke. A suggestion was made earlier that you make policy pronouncements on housing, and I'm very deeply, as you know, involved in trying to restructure housing finance and the housing market. And as much as I personally wish that were true and that you would weigh in on the side of the proposals that I have made and versus others, you and the Fed have been, I think, quite judicious in not doing that. But what you have opined on, and I would like to ask you to say in your own words, is the importance of housing, the housing market and a housing recovery if we wish to have a robust economic recovery and job growth. Would you care to comment on?
Oh, I certainly would, and this is the reason that we have a housing committee, basically, at the Fed, which a bunch of staff and some governors who are looking at this almost all the time. I would say that one of the main reasons that the recovery has been as disappointing as it has been is that usually housing provides an important amount of the impetus to growth, not just construction, but all the related industries and services that are tied to housing. In this case, housing has been very weak. And in fact, it really is, we've seen a few small positive indicators, but generally remains at a very low level. So the housing, the recovery in housing would be a very important boost to the overall recovery. It works through a number of different ways, not just through construction, but by affecting the wealth of consumers and their financial well-being. The mortgage market, the problems with access to credit, for example, mean that the Federal Reserve's monetary policies are less effective than they otherwise would be because not as many people as could be are taking advantage of the low mortgage rates that we have tried to create. There's a lot of other implications for both borrowers and lenders. Clearly, continued poor conditions in housing markets imply losses on mortgages, imply foreclosures, imply people underwater who can't move or sell their houses. So there are a lot of costs at the neighborhood and the household level as well. But I do think that the lack of a housing recovery is one of the big reasons that recovery's not been stronger than it has.
So without advocating a specific solution, kind of like on the budget deficits, you're saying it's something to which we should be paying policy attention.
I think it would repay your efforts to think about ways to make to remove some of the barriers to the recovery in housing. I don't think it's purely a market phenomenon. I think there are a number of legal and administrative and regulatory barriers to housing being as strong as it